3 years ago, there were 3 Arab countries that didn't recognize Israel, that didn't recognize the right of Zionist colonists to rule over any part of Palestine. And those 3 Arab countries were Syria, Libya, and Sudan. So last year, the US and NATO shock and awe bombed Libya, destroyed Libya, killed hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed their water system, left it in ruins. And they also split Sudan in half after a 20-year civil war in which millions of people were killed in a war that was financed by the US and Israel. And now they're trying to do the same thing in Syria. The US and Israel have sent in tens of thousands of terrorists and mercenaries through Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the CIA, and the Syrian people have fought back and have defeated these terrorists, these Contras. They're the same as the Nicaraguan Contras that Reagan financed in the 80s, and that's what's going on in Syria as an imperialist invasion. Israel has been attacking Syria for decades. They've been occupying part of Syria since 1967. Syria has hosted Palestinian resistance groups like Hamas and the PFLP. And when Israel has invaded Lebanon several times, the Syrian army has stepped in to protect the people of Lebanon from Israeli invasion. And they have a high standard of living in Syria, free healthcare and education for millions of refugees, even from the U.S. occupation of Iraq and the Zionist occupation of Palestine and the Zionist invasions of Lebanon. The president was a pharmacist, a doctor who gave up his career to come serve his people for a government that represents the interests of a very diverse population of Sunni and Alawi and Shia Muslims, Christians, Druze, Jews, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, and there was a good life in Syria before this imperialist invasion. And right now, there's a big anti-war movement in Egypt and in Turkey. In Turkey, the government of Turkey is supporting the terrorists who are invading Syria, and they have NATO missiles on the border with Syria, and there have been millions of people on the street in Turkey protesting. And a month ago, the president of Egypt, President Morsi, declared war on Syria and closed the Syrian embassy in Cairo, and it called for a no-fly zone for Obama to bomb Syria. And the people in Egypt came out on the street, and the millions enforced the Egyptian military to depose President Morsi. So now we need an anti-war movement in the United States, and this is a good start here today. I want to thank everyone for coming out, and we need to stop this war on Syria. Thank you.
Now, we have made a very strong statement against any U.S. involvement in Syria. No aid to the so-called rebels, probably more accurately called terrorists, and no falling for any of the nonsense about humanitarian interventions or humanitarian imperialism. The United States, since the coup it staged in Iran in 1953, has become increasingly sophisticated at overthrowing governments that will not kowtow to it. The empire is all about control, 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 for economic reasons, for personal reasons. What would Washington, D.C. be without that control? A little backwater. We only have 4.7% of the world's population. It would be nothing without the empire. So I want to say that Come Home America is what Howard Zinn called in his book, in reference to one of our predecessors, an odd organization. Probably the first anti-imperial organization arose at the time of the American War on the Philippines, the first overseas imperial adventure. And there arose an organization called the Anti-Imperial League. And in it, leading it, was Mark Twain, a fierce defender of the French Revolution at the time, and Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in America at the time. So Howard Zinn remarks, that was odd, but really, is it odd? Is that not possible? When the LGBT movement wants to win something They form the broadest alliances. We should learn from that. When the feminist movement wants to make sure that abortion rights are guaranteed, they form the broadest movement. They form movements across party lines for their goal. We should learn the same.
I just have a few words to say, and as probably most of you know, Syria has the honor and the distinction of being the cradle of civilization, and this is what it looks like after 2 years of civil war, at least partly compliments to all the munitions that are sent from around the world to the opposition forces. You can see what it looks like now. It's really quite a tragedy, to say the least, not to mention that the civilian death toll is over 100,000. And thanks to Carol for loaning me her glasses. I just wrote down a few things I really wanted to stress. And that is that the U.S. and the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council countries, of which many of you may know are Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman, are backing the Syrian opposition against the current Assad government. And keep in mind that they have economic interests of their own to protect. Specifically, the United States imports approximately 160 million barrels of crude oil annually from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Qatar is 700 miles from Baghdad, and it hosts approximately 3,500 U.S. troops at its airbase. The U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet is headquartered in Bahrain. The Congressional Research Service reported that purchases by the GCC 6 countries provided the United States with $66.3 billion from U.S. weapons sales alone. So needless to say, the United States stands significantly to gain from U.S. weapons sales alone to these 6 countries. And that's 79% of the developing nation's market, needless to say, a pretty significant amount. So as everybody, I hope, agrees, sending military supplies to Syria would have the polar opposite effect of promoting any peace in the region. And even though most of us may have long since given up contacting our elected legislators, I urge you to get after both Senator Warren and newly elected Senator Markey and let them know that we're watching them. I have followed around Senator Markey when he was still our congressional rep out in Metro West when I lived, and he has literally celebrated, and I mean celebrated, when the U.S. and Israel destroyed Lebanon. He literally celebrated the day after 1,200 innocent civilians were killed, most of them children. I was there witnessing him hooting and hollering and cheering and singing at a temple in Lexington, Massachusetts. So I know that some of you think, well, at least they're Democrats, at least they're a little bit on our side, well, at least they will represent the voice of the left better. They will not, and you need to join me in getting after them. Jam the switchboard, call their offices, let them know that we're watching them and we oppose any U.S. military intervention in Syria. Thanks, everybody.